Hi, my name is Brian Fox, and I'm co-founder and CTO here at Sonatype. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the evolution of the next generation open source software supply chain attacks. So let's get started. I think it should be no secret to this audience here that developers are using a lot of open source components. The reason for this is that it allows us to develop software much more quickly and efficiently than if we were to write everything from scratch all the time. You can see here some statistics. About 85 to 90% of a modern application is composed of open source components. And you can see lots and lots of downloads of those components across many different ecosystems. If we take a look at the growth trend of the Node package manager, which is the package manager primarily used for JavaScript, you could see a nice healthy growth curve here in terms of the downloads over the last 7 years. And if we look at the Maven Central repository, which is the repository that Sonatype runs for the Java ecosystem, the growth within that ecosystem continues to explode as well. We served 345 billion components in 2020. So why is this happening? Well, when we think about this, we have supply chains that are going into our software. But software is not the first industry, of course, to deal with a supply chain challenge. And so I'd like to talk about several examples of real-world supply chains and how those might translate into the software realm. So this first one here, this is a Chevy Cobalt, and back in 2013, 2014, there were some problems with the ignition system. There was a flaw in the switch that caused the ignition to shut off. Drivers lost power steering and brakes and had crashes, and unfortunately some people died. Now, what's interesting about this is that the engineers found the defect in the ignition switch early on, but they never revised the version number. And so there were multiple versions of the ignition switches being produced and shipped into the cars, but nobody was able to tell the difference. And I think anybody doing software development recognizes this problem, that when you do a new release and you forget to bump the version, it can create all kinds of chaos when it works on one person's machine and not another. And in this instance, the lack of a clearly defined version number for the fixed ignition switch delayed the investigation, leading to potentially more deaths. But then also, when they finally found the problem, they weren't able to target just the cars that were affected. They had to do recalls on every single car, costing the manufacturer much more time and energy and money than it would have otherwise. Right. So this is a very real world problem that we are used to experiencing in software that can have pretty bad effects. The next example was the Boeing 787, and people probably don't remember this much, but when it first launched, there were a handful of incidences where batteries caught fire while the planes were sitting at the gates. Because they did have good tracing of the versions of the batteries, it didn't take very long before they were able to trace that down to a specific manufacturer and a specific lot of the affected batteries. They were able to correct the defect, replace the remaining batteries that had the same defect, and the rest of us forgot that this happened. Right, so this is a contrasting example of what can happen when you do a great job of tracking your parts versus one where you don't. And then lastly, here in the United States, for several years in a row, we had E. coli outbreaks that were ultimately traced back to lettuce. And what usually happens because of the delay in people getting sick and the lettuce going from the farm to the table, and then the incubation period, by the time people start getting sick in numbers that warrants a public health investigation, oftentimes the growing season has moved from one location of the country to another. And so when this happened, because they effectively were not versioning the lettuce, the only recourse was to throw out all the lettuce in the entire country because they couldn't tell where the problem was and which lettuce was infected. So much like the Cobalt, this particular delayed them figuring out what the root cause was, and also caused an overreaction and having to literally throw out all the lettuce. And so after this happening a few years in a row, the growers got together and they started labeling the packages of lettuce with the region of origin so that this would be easier before. So you have three examples here, two of ones that were learned the hard way and one that worked more as we would expect as consumers, that show what happens when supply chains kind of don't work as well as we like to think of them. And of course, in the DevOps world, we talk a lot about Demings, and Deming was well known for helping Japan auto industry rebuild after the war, and ultimately led to some efficiencies that allowed them to create industry-leading cars with high quality and at low cost. And so those four types of rules that we like to think about include sourcing parts from fewer and better suppliers, using only the highest quality parts, don't pass defects downstream for somebody else to catch, and importantly, as I've been talking about here, continuously track the location of every part so that you have a chance of actually knowing where these things are. These are the principles that among others, helped really show that supply chains can be done very efficiently and managed very well. So if we take a step back for a moment and we look at the evolution of what's been happening in terms of open source vulnerabilities and open source security, from my perspective, there's really been three phases. The first phase is more the historical phase where the bad guys were exploiting existing bugs inside of open source and using it to produce unintended consequences. This is basically the same as we've seen in any software application for years. On the open source side, the first instance of this that really became notable was the 2013 Struts vulnerability. And it was pretty much as bad as it could get. The vulnerability existed in the framework, so it happened before any of your custom code was called. It was network exploitable, didn't require authentication. And pretty much if you were running this version of Struts and you didn't have mitigating controls in place, you were vulnerable. And so while it wasn't widely popularized, there were a lot of attacks that went on behind the scenes leveraging this. And it was so bad that it became a module added into a Chinese hacking toolkit that you just point and click at a server and get yourself a shell. And then there were so many attacks happening that the FBI actually released a field alert to their agents to let them know that there were a lot of these attacks going on and maybe they should investigate big companies in their area to see if they were affected. Right, so this was a pretty big deal within the financial industry back in 2013, but not one that rose to the general consensus awareness of the general population. The following year, we saw Heartbleed, which was a vulnerability that existed in the popular OpenSSL project that is used to encrypt most of the world's HTTPS traffic. And then also there was a latent bug in Bash, and this one was named Shell Shock, that had existed for nearly 30 years. And so these two things, they were logoed, they were branded. A lot of people started talking about the security of open source at this point. It started to raise to the awareness of the general public. Fortunately, we didn't change our behaviors quick enough. In 2015, we saw the attacks against Apache Commons collection. And this one is interesting because the vulnerability that existed wasn't even so much a vulnerability. It was a class that existed inside of Commons collection whose purpose was to deserialize code and execute it. That's why it existed. The bad guys were able to exploit that, however, when Commons collection existed in an application that did unsafe deserialization. And the reason why this was such a sweet spot for the attackers is that Commons collection was so popular that it could be safely assumed to be in nearly any Java application, whether it was in the Java application itself or if it was in the web application server. And in this particular instance, this is a hospital outside of Los Angeles and Hollywood called Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. They were ransomwared by an attack that got in through Commons collections in JBoss. And so as a society, these types of things can have great impact. If we think about all of the patients at this hospital, people that were supposed to have surgeries, people that had test results or delayed tests, or ambulances that had to be delayed to other hospitals. I think it's safe to say this impacted lives in a very meaningful way. And so this is what happens when you don't really pay attention to the vulnerabilities. You're not tracking those parts inside of your applications. And then, of course, we think about Equifax. By now, everybody's heard of Equifax. I'm not going to belabor this, but the point I want to highlight here is that it was a mere 2 days from when the 0-day was disclosed to when the attacks, the probing attacks, started against Equifax. And it wasn't just Equifax. About 1.5 years after this, the United States Department of Defense released a report saying that there were many of their installations being probed at the exact same time with the exact same manner as Equifax. So this is not a coincidence. Now, why is this growing so fast? Well, let's take a look at some of the shocking statistics of cybercrime. In 2016, the entire worldwide drug trade across the entire planet was worth $435 billion as an industry. That same year, cybercrime was already $15 billion more. It was worth $450 billion. Now, I want you to stop and think about that for a moment. If you think about how much time and energy is spent talking about the war on drugs and the opioid crisis and the cartels, we as a society spend a lot of time combating that, and yet relatively little time talking about cybercrime, which 5 years ago was already a bigger industry, costing society much, much more money. And if we look at the growth curve, it's an even bigger problem now. They're projected to be worth $6 trillion by 2021. And at the same time, drugs are relatively flat. The reason for this is because it's hard to move physical product around and sell it. But if you're talking about virtual products, stealing information that can be sold on the dark web, if you're talking about mining cryptocurrency, it's a much sweeter target. And the impact of this is that everybody's infrastructure, everybody's application is now a target. It used to be the case that we would think if we don't have anything of value in our applications, if we don't have social security numbers or credit card numbers, then we're not a target by the bad guys. But that's not true anymore in 2021. Everybody's infrastructure can be used to at least make cryptocurrency and turn it into cash for the attackers. So we all are affected by this. The second phase of the open source attacks, I would call they were creating opportunities. So rather than waiting for latent vulnerabilities that existed inside of these popular components to be known and then exploiting them before they updated, the bad guys were now looking at ways to actively create new opportunities for themselves. And the first of this really was in 2017. And this started rather innocently by a report that noted that nearly 14% of the NPM repository, a full 79,000 packages, were published by people who had weak credentials, things that were easily dictionary attacked, passwords like password, or they had checked those passwords into GitHub, and so the whole world could see them. That's a large number. And so this really speaks to the lack of security maturity of your typical open source publisher. And this leads to potential knock-on effects. So what we saw merely few weeks after this were two attacks that were using a well-known DNS attack method called typo squatting. And typo squatting is when you use a name that is confusingly similar to a popular website, or in this case, confusingly similar to a popular component. You publish it in there and you wait for people to make a mistake. Or if they're searching for something, they can't always tell the difference between a dash or an underscore. It can be very simple mistakes. What was really notable from my perspective about these two attacks, however, is that the actual attack, once these modules were downloaded and installed, it wasn't trying to mine coin. It wasn't trying to steal data from the application. It was trying to steal the publisher credentials. So much like the previous one where the credentials were weak, these attacks actually targeted the open source publishers like me, trying to grab our credentials, presumably so that the bad guys could then use those credentials and publish malicious versions of those projects to the official repositories. So this was really a new escalation. And so we saw this. I started talking about it and started talking about it at conferences. And over the next couple of years, there was a never-ending version of new things to talk about. Every time I gave a new talk, there was a new high-profile attack. Unfortunately, this trend continues to today. And so this is just a summary of the initial timeline of these attacks. I'll provide a link at the end where you can go back and read more details about these, because the evolution of this is really fascinating from my perspective. And so as we look forward into what's happened, we're seeing that, of course, the adversaries are engineers. They're seeking the most efficient path, right? They're trying to find the largest way to exploit the most number of targets with the least amount of energy. And there was a study done a couple years ago that looked at the combined reach of the top 100 most popular maintainers of packages in NPM, and they found that just 100 people had the ability to influence or directly contribute to or publish more than half of the NPM repository. Just 100 people. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of packages. And if you look at the popularity of just the top 5 NPM packages, you've got hundreds of thousands to millions of users worldwide of just a handful of projects. So what's happening here is you've got a aggregation of the risk in a very small spot, which is going to target those attacks on either these influential maintainers or these top 5 influential packages. If you look at the flow, one of the things we've seen more recently is people trying to inject code upstream. If you follow that, you've got nearly 100 million plus repositories in GitHub. These repositories, depending on the language, end up being published in many different repositories, from NuGet to Ruby gems for Ruby to PyPy for Python. Of course, there's the Maven Central that we run, and then NPM. And then further from there, all of these packages find their way into the end users. Right, so there's really a force multiplying effect if the attackers can move far enough upstream and inject problems into the supply chain. And that's what we're really battling here in 2021. From that initial time when we started talking about that, for the first 2 years, we saw 216 malicious code attacks, typo squatting, these types of things that were focused specifically on the open source software supply chain. And then the year after that, through half of last year, there was an explosion of 430%. I don't have the statistics yet for 2021, but I can tell you that we've already seen tens of thousands, maybe multiple tens of thousands of attacks just in the last 6 months. So this problem is exploding. It's not going to go away. Worse, we're now in the third phase of this. And this is an interesting phase where the last phase was mostly targeting the open source projects themselves and the publishers. This phase is leveraging those types of attacks to inject things into the open source supply chain. But what's interesting is the actual target of these attacks is not the software that you're shipping and not the software that you're putting into production. It's your developers and your development infrastructure, which is a whole new escalation of the problem. If we look back a few years, there was a high-profile vulnerability that existed inside of Jenkins. It was responsibly disclosed and fixed. Several years later, bad guys found an unpatched version of Jenkins running out there, and they were able to print $3.4 million of cryptocurrency off of this one instance alone. Right, so this was an interesting attack, but unfortunately, it wasn't the only one of its kind. Just last month, March 15th, 2021, a company called Verkata had a data breach. Verkata provides feeds from security cameras to hospitals, police, interrogation facilities, Tesla. and they were attacked in a very similar way, that the bad guys found a way in through the Jenkins server, and from there they were able to exploit and reach around the rest of the network and ultimately gain access to highly sensitive information. Right now, this is kind of the point that we're focusing on. It is undoubtable that the security of the software on the cameras themselves went through probably a rigorous application security testing before it was shipped, before it was put into production. But when you ignore the development infrastructure, these are the types of risks that can be exposed. And so here's a couple of examples. Again, these will be documented in the link I'll provide at the end. But there were instances where components were intentionally stealing credentials. If you think about the credentials at your development machines, whether it's your developers or your continuous deployment machines that might have keys that are able to publish to your production servers or your production databases, stealing those credentials right out of the infrastructure could allow you to come back, could allow the bad guys to come back and access data they shouldn't be. There are packages that were stealing developer passwords. Of course, we talked about the crypto mining and the money. We've seen a number of instances where now they're trying to install backdoors so then they can come into the system later and exploit it. And then we saw last year, mid last year, we saw an interesting one called the Octopus Scanner. This had all the hallmarks of the executable viruses that we saw in the mid-1990s, where every time you ran an executable, it would find every other executable on your system and infect that, and it was very viral in nature. We saw what looked like a proof of concept attack, but still, no doubt, somebody will copycat it, that basically used the development infrastructure to install a backdoor on every system that ran, and then it looked for every other jar that developer had access to and would insert its code into that jar as well. So it virally replicated across all of the developer tooling and packages that developers had. So this shows the escalation and the sophistication of the types of attacks. And again, all of these are focused very much on the development infrastructure. Just 2 months ago, there was a very high-profile sort of new attack that was disclosed. A white hat researcher disclosed that he had exploited more than 35 different companies and collected over $150,000 in bug bounties. And he did this by publishing components to the public repositories using coordinates, the name of the component, that matched internal names of components, and tricking the development infrastructure into downloading those. And so I'll break down exactly how that happens here. So if you're a company and you have a caching proxy, or even if you don't have a caching proxy, the same type of thing happens. And so here we have a model showing Nexus repository as well as NPM. And what's pretty typical in the NPM environment, as well as Python and a few others, is that the default of those tools will be to try and fetch the latest version of a component. And this generally sounds like that's a good idea. It helps you stay up to date. So let's walk through the steps. If I run a build that's looking for the latest React API, my build tool will ask the repository, I need the latest version of React. And there's a version cached here. But that's going to go upstream and it's going to look through all the versions. It's going to fetch the latest one and cache it locally and then serve it back to my application. The next step, I'm asking it for our library. Same process basically happens, except of course our library only exists in our internal repo, and that will be returned. But what if through log file analysis that might have been posted to a bug online or a forum, or through stack trace analysis, or even by interrogating the code running on your website, you might be able to figure out traces of the internal NPM module names, in this case, our_library. And if you're an attacker and you go sign up for this repository, this component on the public repo, and you publish a very high version number, as long as that version number is higher than the ones that you've currently published, that's the one that the system is going to decide is the latest and is going to serve that back. And that's exactly what this researcher did to many organizations. and then published his findings. What we saw was that within just a few weeks, there were a lot of copycats. And ultimately, the malicious copycats came along as well. Sonatype, we found some examples of actual malicious components that were leveraging this and targeting the companies that you see on the left. These attacks were trying to steal bash history files, which might have passwords that were entered on the command line, the Etsy shadow files, which have cached passwords, and they were trying to install backdoors and launching reverse shells. So you could see that what happens is as soon as an attack or a new exploit is released, whether it's an actual vulnerability that's been disclosed and fixed, as we saw in the case of Equifax and the Jenkins and Verkata, or in this case, when it's a new theoretical attack, a researcher published this, the copycats come out in force. What we saw at Sonatype was within 72 hours, there were 300 plus copycats who were clearly after more bug bounties, trying to get the easy cash. Within the week after the disclosure, there was 7,000% in increase in the number of these types of attacks that we had seen in just 1 week. And it took just about a week and a half to 2 weeks before we saw the bad guys leveraging the same technique, hiding in plain sight, pretending to do white hat research, but actually trying to install nefarious code. And then, within a month post-disclosure, we stopped counting when we saw over 10,000 different copycat attacks. And this wasn't just NPM, as you can see here in the middle. It was also PyPy and a few of the other repositories, because they all have the same property where they're typically trying to fetch the latest version of a component. So this is what we're dealing with. The bad guys are paying attention to the supply chain. Every little flaw that they can find, they're figuring out how to exploit it against us to great effect. So what should we do about it? In terms of the dependency confusion, you need automation. There are 20,000 new packages every day. You need to be able to monitor those and find out which ones are suspicious. Of course, at Sonatype, we have mechanisms to do that. One step that you might be able to take is go register your private dependencies or your namespaces. If you're using NPM scopes, for example, you can go register that scope on the public repository and at least prevent an adversary from doing it. The problem is that many companies don't use namespaces because that wasn't part of the default when NPM started. And so you might have hundreds or thousands of internal module names that you would try to register. Tooling is required to really help that. And then, of course, societal pressure on these registries to try and get them to do a better job of verifying namespaces will certainly help make this harder for the bad guys. On Maven Central for nearly 20 years, we've always required that any package published do so in a namespace that is verifiable to a domain. Much like when you have to prove your ownership of a domain to get an SSL certificate, we do the same thing for components that we allow be published to Central. So you can't show up and pretend to be Amazon or Tesla and publish components there. And so we really need to get the other repositories to follow a similar pattern. Otherwise, anybody can show up and publish anything under any name, which ultimately leads to things like dependency confusion and those line of supply chain attacks. One of the studies we did last year, we've actually been tracking these statistics for multiple years. We asked people, how do you manage your dependencies? How do you think about this? Last year was the highest numbers we had. We got to a place where 50% of them had a process for evaluating whether a new dependency was fit for their particular application or not. And 37% of them said they have automated tooling. For years, this was a manual process at many organizations. And so these numbers are encouraging because when we first started surveying people, the statistics were probably half this. So while that's encouraging, if we bring this back to our physical world, would you get in a car or on a plane and eat food when only 50% of the parts were validated and only 30% of them had any recall capability? I know I wouldn't. So why do we accept that for the software that we create? The software that we create is what keeps these planes in the sky. It's what keeps our financial markets working. It's what keeps our cars safe. We should not accept as a society, as an industry, that this is okay. We need to do better. We owe it to our consumers and we owe it to ourselves to do a better job. So, few takeaways. You have a software supply chain, even if you're not managing it, even if you pretend like you don't. And it's shocking that I talk to people who ought to know better, and they don't think they're using open source. Let me tell you, if you're developing in any modern language, and you're doing so in any type of innovative way, even standard way, your developers are using open source components. They're probably using tens of thousands of them. And you may not, just because you don't realize it doesn't mean it's not the case. And so you have a supply chain. The attackers are exploiting those supply chains because not enough people are paying attention to it. And they're moving their attacks upstream where it becomes even more difficult for the average open source consumer to really understand what's going on. Now, time for a self-evaluation. If I told you right now about a new vulnerability that came out last night in a particular component, can you tell me, are you even using this component? How long would it take for you to answer that question across your entire software portfolio? Can you tell exactly which applications? Can you track the remediation of that across your portfolio? And how long would it take for you to ship and deploy an update? Now remember, Equifax was exploited 2 days post-disclosure. That was several years ago. Malicious components are coming out every day, and there is no lag time between release and attack. But how long would it take you to go through these steps? If you can't do that nearly instantly, if you don't have some form of automation that alerts you to the fact that these particular applications have this specific vulnerability, and also if you don't have a continuous integration or continuous deployment type of mechanism where you can cut a new release very quickly, then you're not in a great spot. How will you avoid the next malicious release? They're coming out more and more all the time. They're getting harder to tell the difference. Developers will make mistakes. These things can exploit the development infrastructure merely by installing them. Because like I said before, many of those components were attempting to install backdoors as soon as the developer downloaded it. And so when we bring it back to Deming and we think about the DevOps and the software supply chain principles, those processes and traditional application security chain practices are designed to produce the product of the factory, of the software factory. But they were not designed to protect the factory. So you should do all those things to produce better and safer software. It will lead to a lot of improvements across your process. But you need to be aware that merely doing those things, choosing better components, picking them from better suppliers, all that stuff is not going to protect your factory. I see so many organizations who are so focused, their application security practices on, we need to make sure it passes a check before we release it. That's the main focus. If you're only scanning your applications looking for problems, let's say every 2 weeks before you do a release, what happens to the development infrastructure that installed a malicious component 2 weeks ago? Now you've given the bad guys 2 weeks or longer in some cases to run around your infrastructure, wreak havoc, and potentially exfiltrate data. So you need to think about this problem differently. You need to think about that development infrastructure and design mechanisms that can protect all the way across the software lifecycle. It's not just about the software that you ship. It's not just about the software that you push into production in 2021. And so lastly, as part of that survey we did, we asked a lot of questions and kind of analyzed companies in terms of where they were on their maturity scale of how they managed their software supply chain. And we put them into four quadrants here. The first top left, these are companies that were very, very security focused, that every single new component, every update needed an approval by security. Not surprising, the number of releases or their ability to move forward can be harmed when you have these high productivity these high bars to picking new components. On the bottom right here, these are companies who prioritize productivity above all else. So they said, our most important thing is that we go as fast as possible. We don't want any governance process slowing us down. These ones here, very low performers. They didn't have any process, and yet they still went slow. So we're not going to talk much about them. And then, of course, you've got the highest performers who are kind of doing all of the things. And so the intuitive expectation would be that for people who are focusing on productivity first, I think everybody would understand that if they added some level of governance, that they will probably do better, that their software will be better, but it will come at a cost of speed. And I think people would be willing to make the argument that that trade-off is one that's worthwhile. What we found, however, when we looked at the clusters on as a whole, and we took the average center of each of the clusters, we found that actually companies who paid attention to security actually were the ones who ended up being the more high performers, even more so than the ones who said their only focus was on releasing fast and going quickly. And so that seems counterintuitive until you stop and think about it. Think about how many times in your software career you've stopped and had to fix a bug that was unplanned, or you received a vulnerability report from a researcher. These things never happen at a convenient time. That context shifting and rework comes at a massive cost. And so if you're not at least applying those types of best practices, it will in fact slow you down. So the moral of the story is there are ways to create the best of both worlds, that you can have governance, you can have the ability to allow your developers freedom of choice, but you can put in guardrails. And when you do that, that's the way to achieve both consistently highest performance among all the others, as well as the more secure applications at the same time. And so you can find more about this in our software supply chain report at the URL below. We're getting ready to kick off our survey for 2021, and we'll hopefully have some new insights for everybody coming later this year. And I hope you would participate in providing that feedback. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your sessions.